Konnichiwa Mina, and after a wild delay because I had to get to work on other things that took forever to make the slides, here is week 6 of the 2017 PFA season, the week of September 24th through 25th. So here's the standings after one quarter of the way into the season. In the National East, Manhattan still has a tiebreaker over Cleveland. Omaha has a 2-game lead over Denver in the National Central. Birmingham has a tiebreaker over Jacksonville in the National South, and Hawaii has a tiebreaker lead over Oakland and Phoenix in the National West. And in the Century East, Cincinnati has a game lead over Pittsburgh and Buffalo in the Century East. In the Century Central, Chicago has the tiebreaker over Oklahoma. Miami has the half a game lead over Orlando in the Century South. And then Las Vegas has a tiebreaker over San Francisco in the Century West, as we still got 7 undefeated teams and 5 winless teams. And then here's the schedule for week 6, and it's a big one. We got almost everyone playing this week. First up for the 1 p.m. games would be Baltimore going to Boston, and then Hawaii going to Cincinnati, 2 division leaders going at, so that's going to be kind of big. Philadelphia going to Cleveland. That's going to be a big division showdown. San Antonio going to Jacksonville. That's probably going to be an offensive shootout. And then there'll be Manhattan at Louisville, Houston at New Orleans, Detroit at Oklahoma, big Century Central showdown, Columbus at Orlando, Atlanta at Tampa, and then finally the big interesting showdown for 1 p.m. Birmingham and Washington, a matchup between the top 2 defenses last year and a rematch from the division playoffs last year. Then the 4 p.m. games is Indianapolis going to Denver, San Francisco going to El Paso, Las Vegas going to Minneapolis, which has major implications for the Century Conference. Then Portland going to Oakland, Chicago going to Pittsburgh in their first rematch since the Century Conference Championship, Omaha going to San Diego, and Milwaukee going to Seattle, before we get to Sunday night, which is Dallas at Miami. Whoever wins, depending on what happens with Orlando, will lead the Century South. And then we get to Monday night, the rematch from the very first Wild playoff game ever between the 2 division rivals, Phoenix at Los Angeles. So let's get week 6 underway. So as we get to the highlights, starting off with Baltimore going to Boston in an interconference showdown, as Baltimore needs to win to revive this terrible start to their season of Super PFA Bowl expectations. And Boston's still trying to get their first win of the season. And Baltimore would get the needed victory as they win 34-9 as Boston continues their worst start in franchise history. And that was a very needed victory for Baltimore, since they needed to win big in order to help revive their season, as Baltimore quarterback Andrew Lassiter was 12 of 20 for 181 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick, and Boston linebacker Robert Billings had 11 tackles and a sack. Because, yeah, for all of you that don't know, teams that win by huge margins in PFS, that goes very, very, very good to terms of calculating who's going to win. So the fact that Baltimore won by this huge margin, that can help them get a big streak coming up to hopefully revive their terrible start to the season. So a big win for Baltimore. So after that, we go down to Cincinnati as they host Hawaii, who I believe they played, I think they did play each other last year. If I remember correctly, if they did, the Cincinnati absolutely destroyed them as we're matched up between 2 division leaders in their respective divisions. And Cincinnati would dominate 24-10 again as they tied their longest win streak ever in franchise history. They're now leading the Century East at 4-2. And of course, Timothy Sambrano, who is their backup quarterback since Walter Morgan was out for a bit, is 20 of 38, 309 yards, 2 touchdowns and 2 picks. So although he only did okay, it was still enough thanks to their strong defense. Cincinnati tight end Ronald Derrick had 5 receptions for 102 yards, and their linebacker Adolph Lewis had 12 tackles, and David McKee had 8 tackles and 3 sacks. So a dominant win for Cincinnati as they're in the driver's seat at the moment for the Century East. Then we go back up north to Cleveland as we got a National East showdown with Philadelphia visiting Cleveland, as Cleveland trying to keep up with Manhattan in the National East, as Philadelphia is trying to keep up with them along with Washington as well, especially since they've never beaten Cleveland before. They would like to finally get that first win. Cleveland would get the victory 28-21 as they had to pull a comeback in the 4th quarter in order to get it, as their quarterback Scott Hernandez was 24-44 for 335 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick. Philadelphia quarterback Leroy Black probably had his best game of the year so far. 15 of 24, 278 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick. Philadelphia wide receiver Brian Coombs had 3 receptions, 161 yards and 2 touchdowns. Almost got into the record books. As their Cleveland's quarterback Gerald Todd had 4 receptions, 122 yards and a touchdown. And Ron Marlone, their first-round pick, had 7 receptions, 120 yards and a touchdown. That was his first 100-yard game. And Cleveland safety Theodore Ferguson had 10 tackles. And with this win, Cleveland bests their 3-0 start from last year as they continue to remain undefeated and keep up with Manhattan in the National East. And then we go down south to Jacksonville for a very big National South showdown with San Antonio coming to town to face the undefeated Jacksonville. This is going to be an offensive shit, probably maybe one of the highest scoring games ever, as San Diego needs the win to keep up with Birmingham and Jacksonville. And Jacksonville would get the victory in overtime as they were down 28-10 going into the fourth quarter, but it wasn't enough for San Antonio to get the victory as their quarterback Glenn Cheng was 24-35 for 312 yards and 2 touchdowns, whereas Jacksonville's quarterback Michael Winters was 14 of 23, 286 yards and 4 touchdowns, as San Antonio running back Elvis Smith was 19 carries for 140 yards and a touchdown, and their wide receiver Dion Garno had 9 receptions for 102 yards and a touchdown. Jacksonville tight end James Bennett had 5 receptions for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns, and their strong safety Ernest Gwynn had 11 tackles and a sack. And San Antonio kicker Dometic Matson missed a field goal in the first quarter that would have won and would have prevented overtime in the first place. So, damn, what a devastating loss for San Antonio. They had it right in the palm of their hands and they couldn't secure it, as Jacksonville continues their best start in franchise history. Then we go up north to Louisville, as the Louisville Saints host the Manhattan Greens, as Manhattan's trying to stay undefeated and keep up with Cleveland after they just won earlier today. But Louisville would dominate Manhattan and win 23-6 as they never gave up their lead, as Manhattan would get their first loss in the year, as Louisville cornerback Stanford Fink was 21 of 33, 220 yards and 2 touchdowns, and New York linebacker Frederick Hill had 11 tackles, and Louisville linebacker Larry Mercier had 13 tackles and a sack. So this win also ties Louisville as their best streak in franchise history. As you remember, they won 2 in a row to finally get their first win last year. So now Louisville, after not scoring a point at all in the first 3 games, now scoring 20 plus points in the last 2 games with that really good defense. Could this team out of nowhere all of a sudden finally make a playoff run, perhaps? We'll have to wait and see, as that was a tough loss for Manhattan at losing their first game, as they're now right behind Cleveland. And now we're down in New Orleans for a Century South showdown, as New Orleans hosts the winless Houston, as New Orleans, after that dominant victory against Pittsburgh last week, trying to win again to keep up with Orlando, Dallas, and Miami. New Orleans would blow it as Houston would get their first win, 28-17, as New Orleans had a 17-0 lead, and then until Houston scored 28 unanswered points, and Stephen Hargrove was 24-32, 256 yards, a touchdown to pick, and bad news for New Orleans, as their quarterback James Williams was 3 of 4 for 48 yards before he was knocked out with a broken finger. He's going to be out in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And their backup Philip Ainsworth, who you remember was the backup QB for Minneapolis last year, started, and of course he still continued to regress, as he was 15 of 36, 130 yards, 2 touchdowns, but 3 picks, as Houston wide receiver Joseph Bolin had 3 receptions, 104 yards and a touchdown, and New Orleans linebacker Jeremy Cornell had 12 tackles and a sack. So a very needed win for Houston, a devastating loss for New Orleans as their season continues to fall apart, although I did predict this would happen. Then we go up north to Norman, Oklahoma, as we got a big Century Central showdown as the Detroit Engines visit the Oklahoma Oilers, as the Oilers trying to stay undefeated to keep up with Chicago, and Detroit hoping to get themselves in good position and possibly take over the number 1 spot in the Century Central. And of course, Oklahoma is going to benefit with having Peter Rose back after missing the last 2 games. And the Oilers will stay undefeated as they win 42-27, as their quarterback Peter Rose's first game back after that injury was 17 of 29, 270 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And Detroit's quarterback Charles Cunningham was 20 of 34, 340 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick. so he had a good game too. And their wide receiver Joseph Chavez had 5 receptions for 126 yards and a touchdown, and Floyd Lindsay had 4 receptions for 134 yards. And Oklahoma wide receiver Wilson Kahn had 4 receptions for 168 yards and a touchdown, which is the 6th most receiving yards in a game. So a dominant performance for Oklahoma, as they tied, I believe, their best start in franchise history, or at least in terms of win streaks, since they started off 0-4 last year. So Oklahoma staying undefeated for another week. Then we go back down south to Orlando, as the Orlando Astros host the Columbus Barons, as they're still trying to get their first win, and Orlando's trying to keep up ahead of Miami and Dallas in the Century South. And of course, Orlando's reeling on injuries, with Milton Hester, their starting quarterback, out for this game, as his backup is in. And Columbus would win in an incredible game, as in overtime, as Columbus's quarterback Albert Hendrick was 29 of 44, 425 yards, 3 touchdowns and 2 picks. That's the most passing yards in a game all time, just breaking the record that Robert Robertson set against Columbus a few weeks ago, as Orlando's backup quarterback Dwayne Hollow was 18 of 33, 301 yards and 3 touchdowns, but it wasn't enough, as their Columbus wide receiver Salvatore Nixon, who had 4 receptions for 148 yards and touchdowns. And Orlando's running back Frank Havens had 22 carries for 87 yards and a touchdown, plus 5 receptions for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns, as he's like the best dual threat running back in the league. Orlando wide receiver Jonathan Swanson had 5 receptions for 107 yards and a touchdown. And my goodness, the stats keep rolling in. Columbus's linebacker William LaFleur had 13 tackles and a sack. Orlando's linebacker James Lyons had 15 tackles and a sack. And another big problem for Orlando was their kicker Christopher Lewis missed a field goal in the first quarter that would have won the game for him before going to overtime. That was his first career miss. So, oh my goodness. He was 9 of 9 beforehand. That's a terribly disappointing loss for Orlando. And that was a big win for Columbus, as they finally snapped their 9-game losing streak, one of the worst running in the league at the moment. Then we go over to the west side of Florida, as it's a National South Division showdown, as Atlanta visits Tampa in a crucial game, as both teams trying to keep up with Birmingham and Jacksonville. And Tampa would win it 34-23 to get their first ever win against Atlanta after they got swept last year. Atlanta quarterback Cody Perry was 7 of 12 for 222 yards and 2 touchdowns before he got knocked out of the game due to an injury, but he's going to be ready for next week. And Tampa's quarterback Robert Richardson, remember, he was the backup to Cody Perry last year, so he's going up against his former team, as he was 25 of 34 for 351 yards and 2 touchdowns. Atlanta's wide receivers Christopher Eaton had 5 receptions, 112 yards and a touchdown, and Joseph Eames had 4 receptions for 136 yards and a touchdown. And Tampa's wide receiver Edward Gavin had 5 receptions for 169 yards, which is the 4th most receiving yards in a game. And Atlanta's linebacker Marco Lang had 11 tackles. So very impressive performance of these last 3 weeks by Tampa, as they're right in the mix in the National Conference playoffs, whereas last year, remember, they had the worst start in league history, starting off 0-14. So nice for them to get their first win against Atlanta too, as that was a tough loss to swallow for Atlanta. Then we go back up north to Washington, D.C., as is the undefeated Birmingham Hornets coming into town to face the Washington Americans in a rematch of the division round playoff game last year. Remember, where Washington destroyed Birmingham 24-10 in the battle between the top 2 defenses last year. And as we're going to see, will Birmingham stay undefeated to keep up against Jacksonville? Birmingham failed to get revenge, as Washington would win 12-10, as Birmingham's offense was completely shut down by Washington's defense. Washington's defensive end Ira Washington had 17 tackles and 3 sacks, as Washington's linebacker Joshua Leva had 11 tackles. This was an all-defensive game. Neither offense got anything going, especially Birmingham. That sucked for them, as not only did their win streak come into an end, which was the 2nd longest ever, they now are behind Jacksonville at the moment, who still remains undefeated. Man, the Sack and Sting defense did all the work, but their offense just could not give them the 17 points they needed. Then we go out west to Denver in our first 4 p.m. games as the division rivals Indianapolis and Denver square off in their rematch from their Sunday night game a few weeks ago, as Denver trying to keep up with Omaha in the National Central, as Indianapolis trying to keep up with them as well. As Denver would dominate 34-10 to get their revenge, as they were up 27-0 at one point, as Indianapolis' quarterback Rodney Sanders was 13 of 20 for 182 yards and a touchdown. Denver quarterback Zachary Ellis was 14 of 21 for 284 yards and 2 touchdowns. And their wide receivers, Sol Harmon, had 4 receptions for 113 yards and a touchdown. Indianapolis wide receiver Kevin Ivey had 4 receptions for 133 yards and a touchdown. As Denver's defensive end Virgin Goal had 6 tackles and 4 sacks. Oh my goodness! And also Denver's defense had 11 sacks. Oh my god! That was like up there. It's like one of the most sacks in a single game from a single defense. And just like Baltimore earlier, this was a crushing victory for Denver. Their first one, I believe, of this season, and they really, really need this victory. And that might be hopeful enough for them to possibly get back in contention in the playoffs for the National Conference and maybe challenge Omaha for the National Central. Then we go down south to El Paso as the El Paso Mustangs make their first home game this year as they host their division rival, the San Francisco Union. And James Fabinovidox, who we thought might not play this week, is going to start, thankfully, for El Paso. And El Paso's defense would get the stunning victory 21-6 as they led 21-0 after the first half, and they limited San Francisco to just 6 points. El Paso's quarterback still suffering injury, James Fabinovidox, was 15 of 24 for 150 yards and a touchdown, so he had a solid performance. San Francisco running back Anthony Marks had 28 carries for 147 yards. San Francisco's defensive end Charles Magnuso had 13 tackles and 4 sacks as he's getting up there in the record books. And El Paso's defense, look at this. Their linebacker, Carlos Silverman, 14 tackles. Their other linebacker, Albert Corwin, 11 tackles and a sack. Their free safety, Zachariah Baldwin, had 11 tackles, 2 forced fumbles, and recovering one of them. And their cornerback, Andy Wells, having 10 tackles. So damn, what a defensive performance El Paso put on their division foe. Stay competitive in the Century West. Then we go way up north to Minnesota, and it's Minneapolis, it's in the rain, as Las Vegas visits Minneapolis, a showdown between a strong offense against a strong defense, as Minneapolis is making their home debut against this thunderous crowd of theirs that's always cheering for their team, as we'll see what they do here. And Minneapolis would dominate 27-15 to win 3 in a row to tie their best streak. As they started off 3-0 last year, as Samuel Clark had his best game probably ever, 23 of 32, 372 yards and 2 touchdowns and a pick, almost got him into the top 10 passing yards in the game, but he was just 3 yards short. And Minnesota wide receivers Alan Fernandez had 8 receptions for 102 yards, and Jonathan Kasky had 4 receptions for 132 yards and a touchdown. And Minnesota's linebacker Francis Negrete had 14 tackles, and Eric Witt had 10 tackles, a sack, and a forced fumble, as they absolutely decimated Las Vegas as they held them to just field goals. What a dominant performance by Jacksonville as they won 3 in a row after looking so terrible in the first 2 weeks of the season. Then we go out west as it's a National West showdown with Portland visiting Oakland, as this is a pretty big matchup, whoever takes the lead in the National West now that Hawaii lost. Oakland would dominate Portland 31-12 to tie their best streak in league team history after they win 3 in a row now. And Ruben Williams definitely had his best game as an Oakland Major. 12 of 21, 216 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And Portland's wide receiver Ura Spencer had 8 receptions for 109 yards and a touchdown. Cornerback for Oakland, Emil Cordell, had 11 tackles. What a dominant performance Oakland had as they've won 3 in a row now. And they have the lead for the moment in the National West. Are you kidding me? Maybe Ruben Williams finally getting his shit together so Oakland can possibly challenge for the National West with that strong defense, as Portland continues to struggle this season. Then we go back out east to Pittsburgh as we got a big Century Conference showdown as it's the undefeated Chicago visiting the Pittsburgh Blitz in their first rematch since their Century Conference title last year, when remember was in Chicago, when Chicago won that 21-16, as the Pittsburgh is starting their first round pick Gerald Putin, so let's see how well he does in the rain. Maybe they can finally get their shit right and beat Chicago and give them their first loss, because they need to keep up with Cincinnati and Baltimore and Buffalo, and Chicago needs to win to keep up with Detroit and Oklahoma. Chicago would win in a hard-fought defensive battle 17-16 as Pittsburgh quarterback Gerald Putin was 20 of 32, 172 yards, a touchdown, and a pick in his first game. Alfred Helms, Chicago's defensive end, had 11 tackles and 2 sacks. He's doing really good this year. And Charlie Weber, Pittsburgh's defensive end, had 10 tackles and 3 sacks, which gives him 16 sacks on the season so far, which gives him the 7th most sacks all-time in a season PFA history. So that was very dominant for him. Matter of fact, I think he leads the league in sacks at the moment. And Pittsburgh's other defensive end, Sylvester Napier, had 8 tackles and 3 sacks, which gives him 9 overall in the season. So a hard-fought battle against Chicago, but Pittsburgh just couldn't get in the end as they've now lost 3 in a row to make this their worst streak in their franchise history, as they better get their shit right coming up soon. Then we go back out west as it's Omaha visiting San Diego in a division interconference showdown between 2 division winners, as Omaha trying to keep ahead against Denver, and San Diego still trying to get their first win of the year, which is kind of surprising. I know they were going to struggle this year, but I didn't think they were going to struggle this badly. Omaha would win 36-19 as their quarterback Archie Marvin was 18 of 28, 266 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. San Diego's quarterback Bobby Valentine was 10 of 17, 172 yards and a touchdown. Omaha's running back Mark Metz had 33 carries, 150 yards and a touchdown, as San Diego's defense fought hard but just wasn't enough in the end, as their quarterback Aaron Silvers had 12 tackles and a sack. Their strong safety James Stanley had 10 tackles and a sack, and their cornerback Quincy Raymond had 10 tackles and a pick. And San Diego is off to their worst start ever, as they also got their worst losing streak in franchise history, as Omaha still keeping up with everyone with their 5-1 record as the defending champs. Then we go up north to Seattle as the Seattle Quakes host the Milwaukee Lakers, as this is a very important game for both teams. Milwaukee still trying to get their first win of the season, as they have I think now the longest losing streak now in the league, or one of the worst, and Seattle's trying to win to keep up with San Francisco and Las Vegas. Seattle had to make a comeback in the fourth quarter, but they would get it as they win 27-17 as Milwaukee blew another game in the fourth quarter after they've been so competitive in these last 2 games. As Seattle's rookie quarterback Jody Tucker was 18 of 30 for 247 yards and 2 touchdowns, and their wide receiver Eric Benjamin had 5 receptions for 111 yards and a touchdown. Milwaukee's wide receiver Edward Williams had 3 receptions for 109 yards, and their linebacker Richard Herod still continues to press, having 14 tackles and 2 sacks. So with this win, Seattle leads the Century West, and another tough loss for Milwaukee. And then we go back down southeast to Miami, as it's a big Century South showdown, as Dallas visits Miami. Whoever wins will take the lead in the Century South, now that Orlando lost earlier today. Miami would get the victory 14-6, as their offense was completely shut down by Dallas' defense, but Dallas couldn't get anything offensively going either, so this was a defensive struggle. Miami's quarterback Anthony McCormick was 21 of 33, 209 yards and a touchdown, and Dallas's linebacker Victor Shores had 14 tackles. And Miami now has the longest win streak in the league right now, 8 wins, and it's also 5th best all time at the moment with that 8 victories. Wow, that is just incredible, as Miami continues to lead in the Century South and is one of 5 teams remaining undefeated. And then we finish off the week in a big Monday night showdown and a rematch from their wild card game last year, as it's Phoenix visiting Los Angeles, with Phoenix trying to keep up with Oakland in the National West, and Los Angeles trying to shake off that 3-game losing streak to keep up with everyone else in the National West. Phoenix would get their revenge 24-21 in overtime as they got their first win in Los Angeles, as Phoenix's quarterback James Cruz was 24-33, 393 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's the 5th most passing yards in a game. Los Angeles quarterback Maurice Green was 14-24, 253 yards, 3 touchdowns, but 2 picks. As their wide receiver William Stewart had 3 receptions for 109 yards and 2 touchdowns. And how about this? All three of Phoenix's starting wide receivers had 100-yard games. Craig McCaskill, 6 receptions for 102 yards and 2 touchdowns. William Gore, 4 receptions, 127 yards and a touchdown. And Juan Langley, 3 receptions for 115 yards, as Phoenix managed to get this very needed win to stabilize their season at that strong start to keep up with Oakland, as Los Angeles continues to struggle after now they've lost 4 in a row now, and make it the worst losing streak in franchise history. So after that wild Week 6, here is the standings in the National East as Cleveland leads Manhattan by half a game. Omaha has a 2-game lead over Denver in the National Central. Now Jacksonville has the 1-game lead over Birmingham in the National South, and Oakland has a tiebreaker over Phoenix in the National West. Cincinnati has the 1.5-game lead over Buffalo in the Century East. Chicago still has a tiebreaker over Oklahoma in the Century Central. Miami has the, half-game lead or 1.5-game lead over Orlando in the Century South. And Seattle has a tiebreaker over Las Vegas and San Francisco in the Century West. As Cleveland, Jacksonville, Oklahoma, Orlando, and Miami still remain undefeated, and San Diego, Milwaukee, and Boston remain winless. What an incredible streak it has been so far this season. Who would have thought Cleveland, Manhattan would be this deep in there? Who would have thought Denver would struggle so badly? Who would have thought Jacksonville would be undefeated? Oakland competitive in the National West. Cincinnati leading the Century East as Pittsburgh and Baltimore struggles. Oklahoma being undefeated. Detroit being so good at the moment. Orlando being competitive. And Seattle being competitive too. This has been an incredible season so far. As we go look at the playoff standings right now in the National Conference, at the season ended today, it would be Cleveland and Jacksonville with the top 2 spots, with Birmingham going to Omaha and Manhattan going to Oakland, as Phoenix and Washington would be the teams that would be just barely missing out in the playoff spot at the moment. As you see, Boston and Milwaukee still dead last in that playoff scene very soon. In a couple weeks, we might start talking about playoff elimination scenarios, so I can't wait for that. And then we go over to the Century Conference, where it's Miami and Chicago with the byes, with Orlando going to Cincinnati and Oklahoma going to Seattle, as Detroit just barely got edged out by Orlando at the moment in that wild card spot. As this Century Conference looks a lot more competitive. The teams look a lot better at the moment than the National Conference. And we finish off the week by looking at the Week 7 schedule, and it's going to be a doozy. First up, Jacksonville, Atlanta, the National South showdown right there, along with Tampa at Birmingham. Maybe this could be Birmingham's chance to possibly take over Jacksonville if they beat Tampa, and Atlanta somehow beats Jacksonville. Philadelphia going to Boston, Dallas going to Buffalo, Baltimore going to Columbus. Baltimore needs to win that to keep up with everyone else in the Century East. And Cleveland going to Houston, their rematch from last year. Louisville going to Indianapolis. Could Louisville somehow win and get at 500 for the first time ever? And then the big showdown in the Century South. Orlando going to Miami. Remember, Miami started their incredible streak to end the season last year by beating Orlando 2 weeks in a row. Could they continue it right here? And then the big showdown in the Century Central. Detroit going to Minneapolis. And then for the 4 p.m. game, Manhattan going to El Paso. Oakland going to Hawaii. That's going to be big for this National West on the line. San Antonio going to Kansas City. 2 struggling teams are going to battle out, and someone's going to be 2-4. Omaha going to Los Angeles. That's going to be big still, even though Los Angeles is struggling. Oklahoma going to Milwaukee. San Diego going to New Orleans, between the 2 division winners last year that are struggling. Phoenix going to Portland, and then finally Cincinnati going to Seattle, which is a very important game for 2 Century Conference teams. And then the Sunday night showdown, will be the PFA Bowl matchup we almost had, as it's going to be Chicago going to Washington to square off there, and then the Monday Night Showdown, Denver at San Francisco, as both teams need to get this win badly in order to keep up in their respective divisions. And with that, Week 6 is in the books, and I can't wait for Week 7. What an incredible week this was, as hopefully soon that'll come, and eventually getting to work on the 2017 UFL playoffs. So see you then for either one of those videos.